Welcome to the Permanent Podcast. Real talk about owning, operating, buying, and selling small businesses. The reality is that businesses are made up of people, and people are messy. So, how do you navigate such a messy and complicated landscape? Well, let's talk about it on the Permanent Podcast. Are you going to behave today?
It's a toss-up. I mean, no one likes Morgan. Can we just be honest?
I've never met him.
I mean, if you did, he's a punchable face.
Oh my gosh. This is not good. This is off to a bad start.
Oh, just kidding. That's what makes it fun. Morgan's like one of the most enjoyable people I've ever met. He's a delight, and he's a good friend, and he's just incredible. He can take a wealth of complex financial wisdom and a lot of stuff that he is distilling from really a massive body of work.
Yeah.
He's an avid reader, thinks all the time, and it just has this ability to distill things down to make it understandable. And I think the approachability of his work, he writes well for people that are in it and for people who are not. And I think that's a rare thing.
So I just read the book for this interview.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Yeah.
It's had a huge impact on me.
Yeah, it has a huge impact on you, and it has a huge impact on people that are running hedge funds, right?
Well, we're talking about Morgan Housel here. He wrote Psychology of Money, and he's going to be joining us on the podcast today, and I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I couldn't be more excited. I just love hanging out with him. It's great.
Well, I'm excited to hang out with you and him, and hopefully not have to mediate any fights that you might pick.
Well, the good news about having a fake Twitter nemesis is that when we actually get together, it's quite cordial. We enjoy each other's
That's
company.
good. I'm looking forward to it. Let's dive in.
Me too.
Morgan, on behalf of Permanent Equity, our staff, our listeners, I feel like I need to apologize for the way Brent has treated you publicly over these last few years. And I just want to take a moment to thank you for your courage, your bravery, and coming on a podcast with someone who's been so openly hostile towards you. So thank you so much for being here.
You know what's so funny, David, is that a lot of people don't know this. This actually hasn't happened in a while, but in the early days of Brent's harassing me on Twitter, a lot of the things that he harassed me about, I sent to him. Like I would text Brent and be like, "Hey, it would be funny if you said this about me." And here's the other funny part about it is that even some of our close friends, not strangers, close friends, have texted Brent and been like, "Hey, this is not worth it to treat Morgan like this. Like, what do you do?" Like they don't know it's a joke. They think it's all real.
He just wants attention, and he's picking on the big dog.
I'm punching the biggest guy right in the mouth.
Man.
Making sure he knows what's up.
So yeah, no, I appreciate your courage in being here today, and I'll do my best to keep him polite.
I'm so looking forward to it. Thank you for having me.
Well, Morgan, I love you to death, man. I mean, we've been friends now for a good long while.
How did you guys meet? I don't even know that story.
I think we were introduced by Patrick O'Shaughnessy.
Yeah, it's been a long time, man. All right. Well, so I want to tell a story. So my neighbor the other day, no kidding. I'm trying to do this whole get in shape thing. It's part of this dad bod challenge that David and I are actually participating in / losing in. But I was in the gym the other day. This is going to shock people. I know. That's why I just want to
humble brag. You guys want to buckle up for humble brag?
I'm not bragging anything.
I was in the gym the other day and just getting it.
Which way to the weight room? Yeah. And literally a neighbor of mine came up to me and said, "Hey, do you know Morgan Housel?" And I was like, yeah. And he goes, "Oh my gosh, man. His book has changed my life. Like, his book is incredible." I was blown away by it. And it's like 2.5 years after it was published. And I feel like people are still finding it. Like the guy who is in the gym, my neighbor, he's a financial advisor. Okay. This is literally what he does. And I feel like that it's amazing to watch the impact that you're having in so many people's lives. I mean, you've sold over 2 million copies, but what did you think the impact was going to be? And is it surprising to you how widely the book has traveled now?
Well, I'll give you two sides of this answer. One, the technical answer of what did we expect? Well, the easiest way for me to sum it up is the first print run was 5,000 copies. And we really genuinely thought, with our analysis, that might be all it would sell. And if you understand the economics of books, if you can sell 5,000 books, that's great. Like the median book is like less than 1,000 copies that it will sell. So even 5,000 copies was like, we got to work to move these. It's really hard. It's hard to get people to pull out their wallets and pay for something, particularly in content when people are used to free material. It's hard for them to pay $20 for something. So did we expect this? Like never in the slightest. Not even like, oh, I said that humbly, but in the back of my mind, I knew it was going to sell millions of copies. Like, no, it's not. It was never really in the cards. In terms of like how far it's traveled and like people, like the financial advisor saying that to you, an interesting thing is like, of course I love to hear that and it's great, but I've always been like this with my writing where I'm writing for an audience of one, which is me. And I consider myself a pretty selfless person, but for writing in particular, I'm a very selfish writer. I only write for myself. I write things about problems that I'm having, and I write in a style that I like. I write stories that I find appealing, and I never for a second think about the other readers. I kind of do that intentionally because you're going to do your best work if you just love it. You're doing it for yourself versus like trying to figure out who you can pander to is a pretty dangerous way to do it. But when I hear things like that, it's kind of like, wow, I never really thought about, this was almost like my diary of just trying to figure out my own financial problems and write it in a way that I found appealing. And I've always been like that for 15 years, just writing for an audience of one. So when I hear other people's takeaways from it, it's almost jarring in the sense of like, I never even thought that would be the case. I mean, of course, I know I'm writing for an audience. I know there's other people out there. But as I'm putting the ideas together, it really never crosses my mind.
In that vein, you write from personal experience, and you said your personal experiences with money make up perhaps like 1/1000th of what happens in the world.
I love that part.
But maybe 80% of how you think the world works. Mm-hmm. And I guess just because you're such a bad writer, I'll ask you, like,
what do you mean?
What do you mean by this? What is the, like, and is that something that, based on what you just said, is that something that you experienced yourself personally that caused you to create that observation?
I have my own background that has shaped how I think. I mean, one interesting thing from this is like a pretty common criticism of the book is people who say, oh, it's written through the lens of a white college-educated American male. And I'm like, yeah, have you seen me? Of course that's the lens in which it's
very
written
white.
Through. That's who I am. But everybody, including me, everybody is a prisoner to their own experiences in life because nothing is more persuasive than what you have experienced firsthand. And you can try to be empathetic and read about other experiences, try to understand what that might be like, but nothing leaves an emotional scar like what you've experienced. And scars may be the wrong word because a lot of them are positive experiences, but nobody should pretend that if they were born in a different generation, in a different country, or even in the same situation but to different parents, that they would have the same beliefs, the same values that they do today. Everybody is so heavily shaped by that. And I think this is really important in finance. It's important in a lot of things in life, like politics and but in finance, it's really important because most financial debates, if people are debating, hey, what is this stock worth? How should I invest? How should I spend my money? How much money should I save? To the extent that people disagree with that, they're not actually disagreeing with each other. It's people with different experiences in life, different time horizons, different risk tolerances, talking over each other. Because we want to believe that there is one right answer in finance. Here's what to do with your money. Here's the formula, like it's physics. And it's just not. And part of the reason it's not is because we are all so heavily influenced by our own experiences. The best example of this that's so well known is the generation who were young adults during the Great Depression, that stuck with them for the rest of their life. And it's so heavily documented that they were very conservative, they eschewed debt, they didn't invest in the stock market, relative to other generations that had the same information, the same education, but different experiences that thought about the world in a vastly different way. I'll give you one, like to me, the most stunning example I've seen of this. It was many years ago. This is more than 10 years ago. I was doing an interview with Daniel Kahneman, who is a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics. And he mentioned at one point that he is the biggest pessimist he has ever met in the world. He said, nobody is more pessimistic on the outlook of humanity than he is. And we said, wow, that's like that. Like, let's dig deeper there. Why is that? Is that because you have all this insight into biases and behavior? And he said, no. He said, I'm a pessimist. I'm not quoting him directly here. This is a paraphrase. He said, I'm a pessimist because I grew up in a Jewish family in Nazi-occupied France. And he started talking about how, from an early age, he saw how evil people could be. So growing up in Nazi-occupied France, he was like between 5 and 10 years old, something like that. And it stuck with him for the rest of his life, including like financial risk. It's always just ingrained in him and millions of others in that experience that complete and utter disaster is right around the corner. And if you think humans are well-meaning, good, honest, peaceful people, if you experienced what he did and tens of millions of other people did, you are going to view that area of life very differently than the three of us very likely would. So just coming to terms with the fact that you are a product of your past, the majority of which has been dumb luck, particularly where and when you were born and whom you were born to, is a pretty powerful idea for a lot of things in life. But I think it really impacts how people think about money in particular.
What's kind of the pushback that you get from people who read your book, who want to come argue with you? Do they come and argue with you? And what are they most kind of combative about?
Oh, they definitely argue with it. Here's what's really interesting that I never in a million years would have thought. So the last chapter is called Confessions, and I just laid out, here's what my wife and I do with our money. There's no numbers. It's not like here's our income and net worth, but stripping out the numbers, it's as open and honest as I could possibly be about money inside of my own household, including how I invest, which is I dollar cost average into Vanguard index funds, and that's what I do. And I think my entire net worth, more or less, is a house, a checking account, and Vanguard funds. That's literally like 98% of my net worth. And so I put that in there, and I didn't think that would be controversial. I very explicitly say this is not a recommendation. I didn't say that to make the lawyers happy. It's just like, everybody's different. So this works for me. You got to figure out what works for you. But I can't tell you how many people wrote and said, I like the book until I read that. And now I can't take you seriously anymore. Because it is so ingrained in so many people's heads that if you know what you're doing in investing, if you are a smart finance person, you should be picking stocks. You should be day trading. You should have a very complicated portfolio. I understand that intuition. And so I don't get upset with them when they give me that argument. I just think it's fascinating because it gets back to two ideas. One is that there is an assumed correlation between complexity and results in finance, which I think is complete nonsense. There's not. But more importantly, it brings back the idea that just because this works for me, that something else different might not work for you. So when people say, I think you should pick stocks, I'm like, great, like go for it. I encourage you to do it if that works for you. This works for me, to each their own. I'm not a fund manager and I'm not a financial advisor, but I don't consider myself a journalist either. I've always just considered myself as just like an outside observer, just trying to piece together and figure out what's going on. That has downsides because I don't quite understand what it's like to be in the trenches, dealing with LPs, dealing with investors, so to speak. But I just think it's a big upside because I don't have any of the career incentives to push active management because that's the product that I'm selling. I have none of those incentives. So I think like everybody knows the statistics about 90% of fund managers underperform over a 10-year period. But most people in the industry will view that and be like, yeah, but I'm one of the 10%, or here's what you're not. But I think the majority of that is just career incentives. That's how, like, in order to make a financial advisory or fund management business work, you have to sell the high fee products. That's what you have to do. So I think as an outsider who doesn't have those forces pushing on me, it's been much easier to just take the view of like, oh, if for zero effort, you can end up in the top 5% of investors, let's do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a form of humility and it's a form of being intentional about how you want to spend your time, which I think is really beautiful, right? If you asked most people, why are they choosing to make investments? I would argue that they're trying to make more money, right? That's the purpose of it. Most people are not trying to spend less time with their children, trying to do less well at their interests, right? They try to get into investing to try to provide for their families. And the reality is, as you just said, that even the best people who do this full time, and this is their profession, most people underperform because, well, the reality is very few people can actually outperform.
Right. And particularly if you put it in like the trade-offs, if you were to say, look, in an indexing strategy with zero effort, zero time put into it, you can earn, I'm making these numbers up, you can earn 8% per year. Or if you devote your entire life to stock picking, if you are very good and very lucky, you can earn 9% per year. Now, a 1% per year outperformance compounded over a lifetime is a lot of money. I don't want to diminish that. But when you phrase it as like, it's not that because I'm indexing, I'm earning nothing. I'm still getting, 90% of the return that a very talented professional investor would get. The other part of this is that all compound interest is returns to the power of time. Time is the exponent that does all of the heavy lifting. It is the huge majority of your lifetime returns are just dictated by how long have you been compounding for, not necessarily what your annual returns are. So most investors want to answer the question, how can I earn higher returns? It seems like such an obvious question to answer, but it's actually not the most important part. The question you want to answer is, what are the highest returns that I can sustain for the longest period of time? And so by having a bland index strategy, I can focus all of my time on endurance and longevity and truly thinking long term. So I can make sure that the stocks that I do own, I'm never going to sell for the next 50 years. And if I can pull that off, then my quote unquote average index returns are going to achieve like insane, ridiculous success over time. That's the model that I have in my head.
Yeah. I mean, I love it. It's just so interesting because I don't even consider what I do investing. It is technically investing, right? We are taking other people's money and trying to turn it into more money. But like, I've always looked at the resources that we've been given, that we've compounded, as just a tool in our toolkit to be able to do what we love to do, which is work with small businesses and try to help them grow. And so as a result of that, money is produced, like we earn a return, and a return that we've been decently pleased with. And yet the idea is not we're trying to make a return. It's we're trying to serve our customers well. We're trying to serve their families well. And as a result of that, like we make a good swing, you hopefully get a good result, although not always. And it's an interesting mindset shift, as an organization full of operators, not investors, that happen to look like investors, is kind of how I would describe permanent equity.
Yeah. What you do is so much more hands-on. And I mean, that's even not the right term, because the huge majority of investors like myself don't have the opportunity to get their hands dirty. It's just you buy the stock and there's nothing else you can do. Right. And even like mega hedge funds, if you're talking about big companies, you hear like these activists of like, I'm making this up, this is not the actual number, of like, oh, this activist, Carl Icahn took a 3% stake in Disney, whatever it might be. Even when that happens, it's a tiny minority stake. So your ability to actually influence outcomes is pretty diminished. Whereas for you, your ability to influence outcomes is extraordinary.
I hear you say that, Brent, and it reminds me of what Morgan said at the beginning, which is when he's making choices about his writing, he's writing for himself. He's observing and he writes it. And if he likes it, publish. You were somewhat saying the same thing in a sense that I just want to be a really good operator, help these companies flourish. And what's coming is you're getting a huge return. You're becoming a successful investor.
Yeah, I love building things. Like I love seeing things come alive in the world that I think should exist. And so permanent equity in many ways is just the thing that when I got to know how the finance industry worked, it just seemed like the thing that was necessary out there in the world. And it didn't seem like there was many people who were following a similar path. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I have the best job in the entire world. Yes, the money's a result of it. And if we do our job well, we get paid well, right, because we're generating a lot of opportunity for a lot of people and sitting at the nexus of a lot of resources.
And you've aligned incentives and all that.
But the aligned incentives, I'm like, so it's just a different style. Okay, Morgan, I want to talk about one of the favorite stories that I read in your book was about Bill Gates and Kent Evans. Prior to reading the book, I wasn't actually aware of Bill Gates' background per se. I mean, I knew he was a super nerd who happened to get in computers at very much the right time. Had no idea who Kent Evans was. So, the way you frame it in the book is that Bill and Kent both had access to the same technology. Both were seemingly intelligent guys. Bill Gates goes on to build Microsoft, become the richest man in the world for a good long period of time. And Kent Evans dies in a mountaineering accident. And as I read that story, there was a sense of loss and like a thread that was cut short. And thinking through, like, I wonder what Kent Evans would have done the rest of his life. And it's just sort of like a sense of mourning, almost a sense of loss.
Yeah.
And I know you, and I know you haven't talked about this publicly. I'm not sure, maybe this isn't the right format, but like, I know you had a close call and you grew up in Lake Tahoe. You're a heck of a good skier. I would love to just hear how you think about that incident, maybe briefly describe it, and then how has that influenced the way you think about your life?
Oh yeah, I think about it a lot. So the story that Brent's referring to is I grew up as a competitive ski racer in Lake Tahoe in my entire childhood and teenage years. Skiing 6 days a week all over the world and ski racing. And so there were about a dozen of us that were on the Squaw Valley ski team. And I'll give you the short version of the story. If I told you the long version, we would be here all day. But I was skiing with two of my best friends, Brendan Allen and Brian Richmond. And the way that the snow was layered that day was very soft, light, fluffy snow. And then another layer on top of that of very heavy, wet snow. Whenever you have that layering of like heavier snow on top of light snow, the mountain is very susceptible to sliding in an avalanche. we would ski out of bounds. You're not supposed to do it. You have to duck under the ropes that say, do not enter, do not cross. But if you ski out of bounds, that's where all the good things is, because it's untracked. You get the mountain to yourself. And we would ski down, we'd ski out of bounds, and there's no chairlift, obviously, out of bounds. So it would spit us out on this backcountry road, and we would hitchhike back. And we had done that route maybe like a dozen times. It's a pain in the ass to hitchhike back, so we didn't do it that often. But the three of us did it that morning. And when we did it, we triggered a small avalanche. It was pretty small. It came up to our knees, maybe, and it ended pretty quickly. We didn't think that much of it. And we hitchhiked back. My two friends, Brendan and Brian, they said, let's go do it again. Let's go ski that run again. It was great. And it was an amazing run. And for whatever reason, I said, I don't want to do it. But how about this? Rather than hitchhiking back, you two go do it, and I'll drive my truck around and pick you up on the road so you don't have to hitchhike back. They said, great. We went our separate ways. I drove my truck around to pick them up, and they weren't there. And I didn't think much of it. I think I thought like they hitchhiked back because I was late, but the hours went on and nobody had seen them. And we finally later that night got the police and search and rescue involved. And the next morning, the search and rescue dogs found them buried under 6 feet of snow, dead. They got hit by a massive avalanche. The search and rescue people said it looked like half the mountain was torn away. And I always have to have the disclosure of like, everybody has lost somebody dear to them and has probably had a near-death experience themselves. So I don't want to in any way pretend like I'm unique here. But it was kind of a unique way that it happened, at least. Right. And so of course, it had a huge impact on how I thought about risk and how I think about, luck and whatnot, because that decision that I made to not go with them, which was a completely blind, brainless, I didn't think about that decision. It was just like, I don't want to do it again. Maybe I was tired. And so that I was always like that. That's why I didn't want to do it. But that decision was the most important decision of my life and saved my life. The avalanche was so massive that the odds that I would have died too are 100%. It was like literally like half the mountain was torn away when they found them, and they were under 6 feet of snow. I think about that too, of like, in terms of luck and risk, Brendan, Brian, and myself ended up on just the opposite sides of luck and risk that day, because their decision to do it, they weren't accurately, like weighing the pros and cons and the risk. We were 17, just having a good time. And my decision to not do it, I didn't weigh the pros and cons. It was just a completely brainless decision to not go with them. But no other decision that obviously the three of us have ever made was more consequential than that. And I think every single person has some version of that story. And by the way, there are like macro versions of this story too. One of the most incredible is the historian David McCullough, who wrote a great book on the Revolutionary War. He talks about this period during the Revolutionary War where George Washington and his troops were cornered just outside of what is now Brooklyn. And the British were had it right there. All they had to do was sail up the East River, corner them, and it was done. The whole Revolutionary War would have been done. But the winds changed direction overnight. And so the British could not sail up the river for just long enough for George Washington to escape and regroup. And David McCullough talks about, he says, if the winds had not changed direction that night, there would be no United States of America. So there's all these macro versions of this tiny little trivial thing playing out that utterly shifts the shape of history, either for the whole world or for your own life individually. And when you read enough of those stories, you just realize how much of life hangs by a thread. And a takeaway from that that's uncomfortable is all of that can happen tomorrow. Everything that you have can be taken away tomorrow. That's true for the country. It's true for the world. It's true individually. And so it just gives you a much healthier appreciation for risk. It makes you more cautious financially. At least that's what it does for me. But hopefully also maybe just a little bit more grateful about what you have, with the idea that all of this can be gone in the blink of an eye for a reason that seems so trivial and vague that you never would have thought. It's just snap your fingers, it's all gone.
I mean, Brent, I hear you say all the time, you describe yourself as very conservative. It wouldn't be me looking outside in how I would describe you, but internally that's how you would describe everything you do.
Yeah, I mean, I have a mind that runs down all these trails of risk constantly, and I'm constantly kind of calibrating. The issue for me is that it can be paralyzing,
anxiety.
Yeah, and and creating tremendous anxiety. I mean, I suffered from anxiety a lot of my life, and I think that the idea that everything can be lost, the downside of that is you can be paralyzed, not want to do anything. I think that for me, where I've evolved kind of in this is I'm really grateful for what I have, and I'm grateful for the time that I have been given. And Morgan, you and I have had conversations along those lines, and I know that there's a deep gratitude that you have, that you weren't on that ski trip that day, and that it's caused you to look at risk differently, but it's also caused you to be very grateful for the family that you have and for the life that you've been given that you obviously didn't have to be given.
Right. And I think everyone listening has had a near-death experience. I hope for most people, they become introspective about how fragile life can be. Because once you experience it, you just realize we're just on a precarious balance beam every single day. You also see that with things like COVID and Lehman Brothers and 9/11 there's a great quote from Taleb who says, history doesn't crawl, it leaps. Most of the important stuff in history, it's not the slow compounding. It's like you wake up one day and it's like, boom, here's 9/11. Boom, here's COVID. Boom, Lehman Brothers is bankrupt. And it's just these like jarring events that really move the needle. So, if you look at the last 100 years, obviously the biggest news stories, and I would even argue the only news stories that really moved the needle in terms of risk were, the Great Depression, Pearl Harbor, maybe Kennedy's assassination, the end of the Cold War, 9/11, and COVID. Like you can name like 5 things in the last 100 years that you could reasonably say that's the only thing that really mattered in terms of macroeconomic risk.
Which is ironic because no one could have predicted it.
That's it. The common denominator of every single one of those events is that nobody was predicting them until the very moment that they arrived. Even the Great Depression. Robert Shiller from Yale has talked a lot about this, of like, if you go back to early 1929, there were some people who were saying, oh, things are getting a little extended. Maybe stocks are going to flatline here for a little bit. Not a single person, not one documented person has ever been found predicting that there would be a Great Depression and the market was going to fall 90%. We'd have 25% unemployment. Not a single person. So even the events that seem like they may have been somewhat predictable, let alone 9/11 and COVID and things like that, that's the common denominator of the events that make a difference, is that nobody saw them coming, which is, again, is just a very humble thing to think about as we look ahead.
Well, I think that it's interesting to segue into another quote from the book. You say good investing is not necessarily about making good decisions. It's about consistently not screwing up. If we think about how unpredictable the future is, then what is good decision making in your mind? Like what does not screwing up mean when the future is largely unknown and unknowable?
Well, it's certainly true that someone like myself who just dollar cost averages into index funds and has a high savings rate, that even still over the next 40 years, that is still a disaster. There's plenty of historical examples of very long-term, half century or more market declines, particularly most of Europe in the aftermath of World War II. If you were a long-term index fund investor in Germany in 1938, it didn't matter. So there's plenty of examples of long-term investing not working. But I also think for the way that the financial system is set up these days, where anybody with $100 can invest in blue chip companies for virtually no fee and hold them for a long time, the roadblock to investing is not access. It used to be access. A crazy statistic is that in 1929, at the peak of the market mania before the Great Depression, only 5% of Americans owned stocks. Stocks were very much a rich person's toy back then. Not the case anymore. Anyone with $100 or less, even with Robinhood, can be an investor now. So the risk is not access. The risk is that you are going to let your emotions get in the way, and you are going to panic sell. You are going to panic buy. You're going to be trapped in FOMO. You're going to have overconfidence. You're going to, like all of the emotions that scare people out of the game and cause them to make poor investing decisions. That's the risk today. It's actually a new risk in investing, because even 10, 20 years ago, access to financial markets was much less than it is today, much, much lower than it is today.
Yeah.
There's a quote, and I use in the book that I love. It was Napoleon's definition of a military genius was the man who can do the average thing when everyone else around him is losing his mind. And I thought, like, it's the exact same in investing. It's all you have to do. If you can just not go crazy when everybody else is, you're top 10%, top 5% of all investors who are out there. But so much of investing energy and attention is on how can I make the next great move? How can I become smarter? How can I become a genius? It's like, no, just focus on not being an idiot and you're all set. Like, you're going to have so much opportunity if you're just not an idiot.
Yeah. So like, let's say there was somebody who you're talking to who had bought, one of those shitcoin like Polkadot or something like that. And, let's say that had gone down a lot.
Morgan, I bought some Polkadot. He's taking a shot at me. That was for he and I there.
Sorry. I couldn't help myself.
I had FOMO. That's why I did.
I wasn't
to his
ask,
point though. I had FOMO.
Let's go ahead and David, let's dive into your psychological needs.
I mean, that's what I loved about the book, to be real about it, is a reminder of, wealth building. You're looking around, you're comparing yourself constantly. and you look up a lot. You're always looking up to the next thing. And so, I think to me, the shitcoin joke though is I didn't want to miss out. I wanted to be able to have what I saw other people around me having. You look at Twitter and you're like, oh my gosh, the monkeys. Wow, one day I'll own a monkey.
You know that Morgan owns 7 monkeys?
Bro.
Did you know that? Did you know that he's actually,
he didn't list that in his
70%,
investments.
He's 70% of his net worth is invested in
Bored apes?
in digital monkeys.
The crazy thing is all 7 monkeys are named Brent Beshore.
Oh man.
Oh man, there you go. All right, so to get us back on track here. So one of the quotes in the book, you said, it gets dangerous when the taste of having more money, more power, more prestige, increase in ambition faster than satisfaction. In many ways, David, that's what
making poor decisions.
We were just talking about.
Right.
It reminds me of this quote from Epicurus: "Nothing is enough for the man for whom enough is too little."
Yep.
Say it again.
Nothing is enough for the man to whom enough is too little. And I mean, arguably, if you're listening to this podcast, you're in the Western world, you're in the United States, like there's an argument that a lot of us have enough. But as you just said, I want more.
Yep.
I want to, I look up to the people who have more and I'm like, I want some of that. Right. And so Morgan, some people call this the hedonic treadmill. It seems like a common trap. I mean, as we talked about it, no matter levels of wealth that we can fall into. How do you avoid this? Like, how have you thought about this in your life?
To the point about, the hedonic treadmill, not only has it always been a problem, I think it's getting not only worse, it's getting exponentially worse in the last decade. And I'll tell you why. Everybody measures their well-being relative to those around them. There's no objective measure of wealth. Everything is just, well, I have X and my neighbor has Y, and you compare it. And what social media has done to that problem can't be understated, because now the people who are quote unquote around you is a curated list of the most hyperbolic, fake, airbrushed views of the world, where people are just giving you the highlight reels of their life, not the actual point of your life. So it is so much easier today than it has ever been for your expectations to exceed your income. And I think what happened over the last 80 years is that our incomes doubled on average, but our expectations more than doubled. And with social media in the last decade, I think people's expectations have tripled. And you see this, the most astounding, which is probably might be the single most underrated problem and risk in America right now, is the rate of chronic depression and suicide or suicide attempts among teenagers, particularly teenage girls.
Yeah.
It has absolutely exploded, not gone up a little bit. It has gone parabolic in the last 10 years. And when did that shift change? It was 2012 and 2013, which is when Facebook mobile really started becoming a thing. And the scientists like Jonathan Haidt, who have really dug deep into this, it's causation. It's not just correlation. It is the cause of teenage depression and suicide. So that's just an example of when it's so easy to inflate your expectations. Everything else around you or everything else that you have seems inadequate because you're comparing yourself to people who at least appear that they have so much more.
Yeah. So Morgan, how do you think about this personally? I mean, as you've gotten more, and obviously you've been investing in a strategy that has worked, what has been your way of tempering your expectations as they've risen and not falling victim to the hedonic treadmill?
It's definitely hard. It's much easier to say, don't move the goalpost than it is to do it. And so my wife and I have experienced that for the last 2 years. I would say, not to dig too far into my personal finances here, but I've saved every single penny from the book. We haven't spent a single penny of the book money that we made.
What?
But I would say,
girl, you can buy me something nice.
but I
Who's
would
the
say,
girl? What are you even saying? Are you the girl? Is he the girl?
Is that you, Brent? I would say, I think it's always important to remind yourself, because it's true for everybody, nobody's thinking about you as much as you are. Nobody cares about your stuff as much as you do. Nobody cares about your house or your car or your clothes as much as you do. They're all busy thinking about themselves. Once you really take that to heart, then the game of putting out your peacock feathers and showing the world how rich you are with nice stuff, clothes, cars, homes, whatever it might be, really diminishes. It doesn't diminish to zero, but once you realize how dumb that game is, and how, what the rules of that game, the social status game, once you really dig it deep into it, you're just like, it's so stupid. I should just focus on things that actually legitimately make me happy, which for myself and my wife and my family is independence and autonomy, which you get from savings. That's where you get independence from, is just having a ton of money in the bank in investments that you can live off of. So that's what I focus on, rather than doing it for the applause and the attention and the admiration of other people who are by the way, are not even giving it to you. They're thinking about themselves. It's just the internal scorecard of what can I do with my money that will make it so that I can wake up every morning and say, I have control over my day. I have control over my time. I can do whatever I want today. I can spend as much time with whoever I want for as long as I want. That's what I want. And, so that's where the savings comes in. It's not that I'm a pessimist saving for a rainy day, or it's just like, it's all about hoarding. It's like intentionally fostering independence with your wealth.
Okay, so I'm going to push you a little bit, and maybe this doesn't make it into the final podcast. Why do you keep flying around the world then to give talks when you have enough money?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. And it's something that my wife and I talk about a lot, because, is the money nice? Of course it is. But like traveling is hard. It's really hard. I would make a point here that having a sense of enough does not mean that you have no aspirations for more. I think I'm always going to want more money. I'm always going to want a higher net worth. To me, what enough means is that your expectations are growing slower than your income. So if your income is rising by 10%, make sure that your expectations are rising by less than that. And it's hard to measure what your expectations are. It's hard to put like a figure on that. But I would say I think we have done a pretty good job. It's still a joy for me to be paid for things like that, because my expectations are still below it. Whereas you can easily imagine where someone who just feels entitled to that kind of money and expects it, and when they receive it, it's not bringing them any joy. It's just meeting their expectations, or it's not even meeting their expectations. And that's where you get to some people who are very wealthy and very miserable, is when their expectations exceed whatever their growth in life.
I mean, I think, if I could answer the question that Brent just asked you, why would you keep going? I think particularly as a creative, but I would say as all humans, there's a desire to have impact, right? Yeah. And like, you're seeing yourself have impact when you go speak and when you're writing. And I'm actually kind of curious, just as a fellow creative, and you're someone I really respect in that way. Like, you say you have an audience of one, but you also want to have impact, right? Like, how do you kind of gauge, is this going to have impact, or do you literally not care? You're just going to put it out?
It's not that I don't care, David, but it's just that it's not part of the equation when I'm writing. When I'm writing something, the question I ask is, would I want to read this? Yeah. Is this interesting to me? Not will somebody else find this interesting? Not will somebody else learn from this? But like, do I learn it? There's a big misconception with writers. I think this is true for almost every single writer who's out there, that when somebody writes a book, they already, like before they wrote the book, they already had all that information in their head and they just spit it out onto the paper. It's almost never true. Definitely not true for me. That the process of writing it is what teaches you. So when I start writing a blog post or a book chapter, I have no idea what the answer to that topic is, but I write one sentence and it reminds me of something else. I write one paragraph and I say, oh, let's think deeply about that. I'm not just spitting out things I already have in my head. It's a learning process as you write. And that gets back to the selfishness of it, of like, when I'm writing these things, I'm trying to answer questions that I have myself, rather than, oh, I already have this built-in knowledge, I'm just going to regurgitate it for people. It's really not thinking about other people. It's just trying to figure out my own problems. And if I can share those with other people and make a living doing it, all the better.
We interviewed Shane Parrish a couple weeks ago, and so much of what you guys were saying, it sounds so similar. I don't know how closely you followed Shane, but just this curiosity and sharing that openly and trying to have integrity towards what's interesting to you.
Yeah, and it's actually shocking how few people do that in life, including, lots of product managers design products that they would not use themselves. Lots of entrepreneurs are not solving problems that they themselves have. And maybe like sometimes that's okay. But to me, most people do their best work when the work that they're doing is deeply personal, because it's solving a problem that they have, or it's interesting to them, or it's a product that they would use. Your work product and your ability to achieve flow and just like the enjoyment that you're going to have is so much greater when you're doing it for yourself.
So we talked a lot about how you're saving a lot, you're compounding your capital. Obviously, you write about the benefits of doing that over time. Do you think there's an irresponsible way to save money? Do you think that you can act irresponsibly by saving too much. And I'm sort of sparked by the question. One of the favorite books I've ever read was The Billionaire Who Wasn't. It was about Chuck Feeney, right, who created the duty-free shops. The book was kind of like popular, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. And it was deeply impactful to me of like, he made all this money and then he really spent the rest of his life giving it away. And it almost felt like there was like a moral imperative to not store up and not to rely on wealth to give you something that it can't, and almost like a corrosive toxicity to that. So how do you think about oversaving, or is there a concept of oversaving, or how do you think about it?
I think the book came out the same week as mine, actually. It's a book by a guy named Bill Perkins, who wrote a book called Die With Zero. And kind of self-explanatory, like that should be your goal. Like it's like the old joke, like the goal in life is that the check to the undertaker bounces, and that's when you know like you've lived a good life. And it's not like, oh, YOLO, go spend your money, but hey, if you want to use your wealth to leave some money for your kids, give it to them while you're still alive, and you can see the benefit of it, rather than waiting until their old decrepit father is 92 years old and dies and then they get all the money. Like, be more generous with it while you're alive. So this thing's a way that you can utilize your money while you are living in a way that's gonna give you a lot of happiness. So that really appeals to me. When I read that, I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's actually changed, at least at the margins, how my wife and I have thought about what we're going to do with our kids. I think for a lot of people, the process of becoming richer is much more enjoyable than being rich. Like having money is cool, but getting more money is even better. So the process of investing, I think this is probably true for you as well, Brent. Like, you love small businesses and growing small businesses, helping small businesses. And so even if you took someone who said the purpose of business is to make a profit and to make more money, true. But I think you like the daily grind, at least to some extent. Like, that's in your blood. And even if there's part that you don't enjoy, it's still like in your blood to go out there and do that. So can somebody oversave? Yes. And I'm sure there are quite a people who on their deathbeds say, man, I wish I traveled more. I wish I treated this person better. I wish I donated more to charity, whatever it may have been. I wish I went out to dinner more often. I'm sure that happens, not only sometimes, but a lot. But I think at a society level, by far the much bigger problem is people who reach 75 years old. They can't work anymore. Their back hurts, their fingers hurt, and they don't have any money. And they say, oh shit, what do I do now? That's a much bigger problem than the people who die zillionaires.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. So our audience, there's a lot of owners, operators of businesses. And if they do a good job, there's going to be leftover capital, right? For that pool of people to use to reinvest back in their business, for them to invest in other things, however they choose to use those resources. How do you think about, if you're advising a friend of yours who's a business owner, the vast majority of their worth is tied up in their business. They're doing well. They're financially comfortable. They're not super rich. How do you think about advising them on the things that they should think about doing with their money? And does it deviate from kind of how you think about investing your own capital?
I'd first say that I don't have a lot of personal experience with the situation that you just laid out. So I'm not an expert on this by any means. What I would say that is very likely in that situation is that the wealth that they have tied up in their business has an extremely emotional component because there's so much sweat equity built into it. The business is their baby. And so if you compare that to my Vanguard index funds, it's completely different. Like, I enjoy my Vanguard index funds, but literally all I did was clicked buy versus the person who sweated 18 hours a day for 30 years to build this business. Totally different situation. That of course can have a lot of just the concentration that brings to a lot of people has a lot of downsides. But I also think that a lot of people can be willy-nilly with their stock investments. It's the classic thing of like people spend a month researching the best refrigerator to buy, but then 6 seconds on what stocks they should buy. And so I think a lot of people who are not entrepreneurs can be pretty careless with their investments versus the entrepreneur who has 99% of their money in their business. They're probably going to watch after that deeply, quite a bit. This is much more in your domain, Brent, but that's all I can think of from the high level of just how emotional that asset would be relative to 99% of other assets, which are just cash or stocks or something that's great, but doesn't provide any value in your soul.
I'm curious though. How do you think about that, Brent?
Yeah. I mean, we're dealing with, working with owners and operators, all day long. And Morgan, you're spot on, is highly emotional. And I think those emotions oftentimes impact sometimes positively in terms of it's a real motivator for them to continue to build and grind on it, which is what's required to build a business. I mean, I literally don't know any business owner who's like, oh yeah, that was easy, right? It's brutally difficult. It also, on the flip side, can be detrimental because the asset itself isn't looked at as an asset. It's looked at with sort of a sentimental lens and being something that needs to be stewarded. And I mean, this is what obviously we're trying to do with the businesses that we get involved in, is helping those families steward those assets well. And so you end up getting in a situation where the owner of the business shouldn't be the owner any longer. Maybe there's health issues, there's been some event in the family, but they can't give it up because they're worried that the entity itself and the families that are all connected to that are going to be harmed by that decision. And so it is a complicated thing. And I joked that we could just, poke a buy button and poke a sell button, right? And that we didn't have everything tied up in it. And then I look at all the levers, as you said. I mean, there's literally, if you can just poke, buy, and sell, those are the only two things you can do, versus all the levers that we can pull to be able to try to help make the companies better, help try to grow the investments.
And have impact.
I mean, ultimately, that's what we're trying to do.
Right.
Brent, I'm curious if you see situations where, because the business is so emotional and so sentimental to the owner, that they overvalue it financially. Because this is just like everyone looks at their kids. My kid is the smartest and the most talented and the best looking, because it's your kid. That's why you think that. If when someone is selling it, they're like, oh, this business that I spent my life, this is my baby, and therefore I think it's worth 2x what a proper market value might be.
There's a similar arc that I've noticed when owners come directly to us. So they have not been through a process. There's no banker involved. They just come to us. One of the first questions I like to ask them is, so where are you in this process? Who else have you talked to? How long have you been thinking about selling your business? Because too often, almost all the time, when somebody says, oh yeah, look, you're my first stop, which we love to be the first stop. We love for them to call us. But usually what happens is somebody says, well, Bill at the country club sold his business 2 years ago for a 15x multiple. And I don't know if our business is worth 15x, but something in that ballpark. So, I mean, look, there are businesses that are smaller that do sell for 10x plus, but it's very, very rare. And so oftentimes it's not a helpful thing for us to be the ones to educate them on that process. And so we'll have this, we had one deal that we closed. It took 6 years for the person. The first time they came to us, their expectations were literally 3x of what they ended up selling the business to us for. And it wasn't because we were trying to grind on them to come down. It was just, hey, here's the reality of the situation. Here's our opportunity costs. Here's what we think is the risk in the business. And over time, they started to see it more and more clearly that there were risks, right? I mean, when you're in something, I think it's not only just like the endowment effect, which I think what you mentioned, Morgan, of like, you have a house, you think the house, because it's your house, it's worth more. It's also that you can't see the risk because in many ways the owner is the stopgap of all that risk. And they've learned over time how to navigate that risk. And if you pull them out of it, the risk, therefore the value of the business, the risk goes through the roof, and the value of the business goes through the floor.
Yeah.
And they can't see that though, because for them, it's just, look, they're playing music. It's, everyone can play music, right? Like no big deal. And it's like, well, there's a big difference between, playing experimental jazz and putting on the latest pop song on the radio. Those are two very different processes. And so oftentimes these business owners have been playing jazz for so long, they forget that that's what they're doing.
Right.
That's a cool analogy.
I like it. Yeah.
So when a lot of these business owners, they are generating capital out of the business and they're investing it in, there's two different minds on this idea of like, does it take different things to become rich or become wealthy versus to stay wealthy? And like, how do you think about that dynamic?
I definitely think, getting rich versus staying rich are not only different skills, they are opposing, conflicting skills. And for someone to do well over time, you need both in equal parts. You need to get them to coexist with each other. And it's pretty rare. I think there are a lot of people who are very good at getting rich. You see that every market cycle. There are some people who are good at staying rich, but they're good at holding on to what they have, but like extreme growth isn't that much. Very rare that you have someone who is truly barbelled. Back to the person who we were talking about earlier, Bill Gates is, I think, one of those people who back in the 70s, when he started Microsoft, took the biggest, most audacious risk of maybe any entrepreneur of saying there needs to be a computer on every desk in the entire world. It was like the craziest, most ambitious risk anyone had ever taken. At the same time, during his entire reign as CEO, from day one, he said he always wanted enough cash in the bank to make payroll for 1 year with no revenue coming in. because he always said that even when Microsoft was at its most dominant, nothing is ever like this can all be ripped away from you tomorrow. There could be another competitor who just comes right in and just steals everything from you tomorrow. So while he was like massively optimistic and risk-taking, at the same exact time, he was very pessimistic and very conservative. So you need that barbell to work together with each other. So getting rich and staying rich is really important. I think for individuals, it's the idea of like save your money like a pessimist and invest your money like an optimist. Save with the idea that what's going to come down the pipe in the next 12 months, 5 years, 10 years is going to be a constant chain of surprise and setback and recession and pandemic and war and whatever it might be that's going to throw us all for a loop. But with the idea that if you can just endure that and stick around for long enough, then the rewards that are very likely to come from somebody who invests like an optimist are going to be great. So getting those two things to live with each other at the same time is pretty difficult. And I would actually say that most people, it's not that they are endowed with one or another, it's that they toggle between the two. They toggle between optimism and pessimism. When, in 2021, I'm a huge optimist on crypto. In 2022, I hate it. It's all going to zero. And it's just that pendulum back and forth. Whereas I think to do well over time, you need to have them both coexist at the exact same time with each other, which is very difficult.
I think you're right. And I think that balancing act is incredibly delicate and difficult. And it seems like and maybe this is just on Twitter or, the sort of the zeitgeist of our day, but it seems like pessimism is seductive. It seems like that pessimism is the thing that people are encouraged by, rewarded for being pessimists over optimists. Have you noticed this? And if so, why is pessimism so seductive?
It's always been like that, and I think it always will be. Kahneman, brought up this great example that from an evolutionary perspective, it makes a lot of sense that species are more attuned to threats than opportunities because the first goal is to stay alive. Because if you die, the opportunity's gone anyway. So you have to be keenly aware of threats and somewhat aware of opportunities. That's the most reasonable path to be in. I also think from the media perspective, pessimism sounds like somebody trying to help you, and optimism sounds like a sales pitch. Pessimism is like, there's this big recession coming, and let me help you to make sure you don't get hurt. That'll catch people's attention. But if someone says I know the stock idea that's going to double in the next year, people will rightly say that's probably a sales pitch. That's probably bullshit. It's probably not true. And so because of that, it's always going to be the case that we are much more attuned to the threats than the opportunities. The other big point about this is that most good things in the world come from compounding, which happens slowly. 2% growth per year, 5% growth per year. And if you compound that over 50 years, you change the world. But most threats happen very quickly. So bad news happens overnight, but good news takes a long time to play out. So think about 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. Both of those massive events literally took place over the course of 1 hour. From start to finish, they were over in 1 hour. The world was completely changed. There is no equivalent of that on the upside. There is no massive breakthrough that takes place in 1 hour. And if you look at the incredible things that have happened to society, the massive decline in heart disease fatalities over the last 60 years, literally declined on a per capita basis 80 or 90% in heart disease over the last 60 or 70 years. But we don't pay attention to it that much because it was a 3% improvement every year. So over 50 years, it's this ridiculous improvement to society, but we never pay attention to it because it happens so slow. If you compare that to Pearl Harbor, that takes place in 1 hour, it's just a totally different beast.
At reading your book, I get so excited. My personality's like, yes, I want all of this. And I get this deep sense of impatience. And it's I can't wait to have patience. I can't wait to have compounding. And I just am filled with this. I'm impatient.
About wanting patience?
Oh, about wanting patience. It's my experience. And our mutual friend, Tim Hansen, has been a big influence in me and how I think about money, which, by the way, I'm supposed to confront you for not promoting his new newsletter on Twitter. He's really deeply hurt.
He's really raw about it. Yeah.
I responded to it. Tim used to be my boss. I don't know if many people knew that, but Tim was my boss for a good 3 years. He's a great guy and a great writer. I will plug his newsletter here because Tim was Tim was a writer for the Motley Fool before I joined. So when I did join, and I was a brand new apprentice writer, he was someone who I really liked.
And Tim wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Morgan. Literally.
I've heard the story. What is it?
I mean, Morgan initially, I think, had told Tim about us, or there's some signaling from Morgan about us. And then when Tim applied for the CFO job,
you were
I called Morgan and I was like, hey, so who's this Tim guy? And Morgan's response was, oh man, he's amazing. There's no chance you'd ever get him. I was like, thanks, bro.
Pessimism right
Did-
there.
did
That's
I say
pessimism
that?
self.
Oh, that's exactly. That was your first reaction. I was like, hey, can we just dial it back a little bit? Like, come on, man.
So funny.
I
don't
appreciate
remember
that. All right. Well, hey, so I want to talk about stress. And you say in the book, the further you go back in history and you look, the more general your takeaways should be. General things like people's relationships to greed and fear, how they behave under stress, and how they respond to incentives tend to be stable in time. So, how do you think about the intersection of greed, fear, and incentives under stress? And are there lessons that we can learn that are sort of inevitable based on experiencing that combination?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway from it, you just alluded to this, is those things have been around forever and they will be around forever. There's always a sense whenever there's a market bubble, particularly after it bursts, of like, how did this happen and how can we prevent it from happening ever again? You're like, you can't. It's completely ingrained in human nature to have excess in either direction. Excess optimism, excess pessimism. That has always been the case, and it will always be the case. So there are these like big macro behaviors that are just part of the human condition that will always be with us. And that's important because so much of the effort in the financial industry goes towards trying to predict what is going to change. How's the economy going to change? What industries are going to change? What sectors should I be in for the next decade? And there's not enough emphasis on what never changes, just the behaviors that we know are going to be around. So I have no idea what sectors to invest in for the next decade or what sectors are going to win for the next decade. But I know like how people respond to greed and fear because it's always what they've done and never changes. So if I put all my emphasis into what's never going to change, that just from a starting perspective, that's a much smarter way to think about forecasting in my view. Some of the takeaways from it, though, it's just I think it's true that people always have to overshoot the boundaries of what seems sane, because what investors are really trying to do is figure out the boundaries of how much another investor is willing to pay for their asset, their business, or their stock. They're just trying to figure out like what is the top level that somebody will pay. The only way to figure out where the boundary is to that is to go a little ways past it, and then to look back and be like, oh, that was too much. Okay, like we made a mistake there. We were being too greedy there. So I think like the process of boom and bust, it's not people being crazy. It's not people being greedy. It's people as a whole, very reasonably just trying to figure out what the boundaries of what other people are willing to put up with. And that's why these things keep happening again. It's not a mistake. It's not a flaw. It's just an inevitable part of how the risk management system works in investing. Because if somebody said, okay, let's imagine a world which somebody says, the stock market should return 8% per year. So we're going to value stocks so that they return 8% and not any more. You know, that we're just going to stop right there. In that situation, you're going to have somebody that's like, well, what if it's 9%? Like maybe I should bid up the price a little bit more to see if I can get there. And people are just always trying to test the boundaries of what the limits are. So I think that's the biggest takeaway of what this is like when you understand risk and greed from that perspective of just people trying to figure out where the boundaries are, you become less cynical. And less like, oh, everyone's so greedy. Everyone's so stupid. They're so panicking. Like, no, it's just like a very normal, natural way that these systems play out.
I'm honestly struck with your charitability, your humility as you look around, and you're just able to diagnose the reasonableness, to use kind of a framing from your book, that people move and make decisions. And it's really refreshing to kind of have that lack of pessimism, that lack of cynicism, and just go, look, this is why it's working this way.
There's this great quote that I love. I got from my brother-in-law, who's a social worker. He works with very troubled kids. And he says, all behavior makes sense with enough information. Now, he means it in the context of,
right.
Of an 8-year-old who's, being violent at school or something.
Right.
But if you look at that child's home life and
That's
see
right.
how terrible, it makes sense. And I think it's the same in the economy. And once you understand that, you become more empathetic, that the huge majority of people are just trying to make it through the day the best that they can. And to the extent that there is bad behavior, a lot of times it's just it's collateral damage from good intentions or people who have different goals than you. Of course, there are truly terrible people in the world and always will be, but the majority of what people think is something bad in the world is a collateral damage from a good intention.
I tell my sons all the time, when you go to school and there's someone who's really hard or someone's really mean to you, very possible that kid is coming from a hard home and they're just confused and lashing out at school. And I don't know, I think they're more frustrated when I say it than maybe inspired because they're dealing with someone who's very difficult. But I'm hoping that kind of like a faucet, just kind of dripping on a dirty plate over time, it helps shape a little bit of how they see the world and how they see people.
Oh, I think it's definitely true that bullies are not just at school, but for like grown men who are bullies, and there's a lot of them are
like Brent Beshore
hiding,
to you.
I was going to say,
Brent Beshore to
are we
me.
talking about my Twitter presence?
He was actually saying something meaningful and we cut him off. So welcome to Brent and I's.
welcome to Dave and I's relationship.
But I mean, it's just so much of that is hiding, like, or covering up some sort of pain that they have. Yeah. I think that's really true. But it's actually a great thing to come to terms with, because then you become less cynical about the world.
I love that. Okay, Morgan, if you're willing, we kind of end every podcast conversation with two things. We do a lightning round where we're going to ask you for hot takes. You seem like a guy who might be hesitant to give the hot take. I don't know.
You need to give some spice it up here.
Yeah. We're just going to throw some things at you and would love your instant reaction to it or your insights on it. Does that sound good?
Hit me. Let's do it.
One of the things we're actually going to, you're the first person I'm framing this for, but we're going to start doing it. We want to build a little bit of a digital bookshelf. And so we're asking all of our guests that come on to throw some books on that bookshelf. So you could do something you just read recently you're excited about or that you've been thinking about, or just a couple books you think needs to go on that digital bookshelf. We're going to make a webpage for it.
All right, my favorite U.S. historian, he's not that well known. Is a guy named Jay Winnick. Last name is Winik, Jay Winnick. And he wrote, he's written several books, but the two that I think are extraordinary. One is called April 1865, which is the month that the Civil War ended, and then 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And he details how close America was to falling apart at that moment. And we know in hindsight, it didn't. Like, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, but things kind of stuck together, and there was a transition of power. It was not guaranteed at all. And he really highlights how, both between the Civil War and Lincoln's assassination, how crazy, like, that month is what built America.
I don't want to brag or anything, but I have a minor in history from the University of Missouri, so you're scratching my itch here.
I mean, basically, David could have written either of those books.
I could have written, I might have some thoughts to share. I'll read them and give
he's humble. He's humble about it.
I'll share my thoughts on Twitter after I skim it.
Yeah, that's good.
Fair.
All right, let's do the lightning round.
That was the beginning of the lightning round.
Well, we're actually going to do the lightning round now.
That was one, and then now you just continue.
Okay, well, number 2 in the lightning round. The second question of the lightning round. Give us your hottest hot take on the Bitcoin.
If it was going to die, it would have died 10 years ago. The fact that it is still around, like the Lindy test, that it's still here, is probably some indication that unless it's actually regulated into oblivion, it'll still be with us 10, 20 years from now. That's my only hot take.
Would you cross that over to other tokens then?
I had a take about a year ago where I said, if you don't think that some of the crypto world is fascinating, you're not paying attention. And if you don't think that most of it is absurd, you're not paying attention. Like, I think both those things are probably true. By the way, that's true for any new industry, that 90% of it is absurd and 5 or 10% of it is really cool. It's just, I just think it's impossible to know what the 5% or 5 or 10% is going to be until we have hindsight.
I have a friend who lives out in California, and his hot take on the whole crypto side is that, like, anything new, basically it's all the hooligans, like all of the pirates are the ones who are first going to jump in and try to, like, do something, like take advantage of the situation. But out of that comes this incredible creative energy that then becomes like a momentum builder, that then people who have maybe more pure motives and are less piratey come in afterwards. And it was actually like, when he said that to me, I was like, that actually makes a lot of sense, right? Like, there are different, I forget there are different phases of technology, and it's so easy to look at the latest thing and, have a friend buy Polkadot or something like that and have it go bust. And then,
I'm not even going to tell you the other tokens I've had.
I know,
I'm going to let Polkadot be the representative for all the shit coins I bought.
I was going to say, Polkadot is emblematic of
a few others.
Things. Yeah, exactly.
So is Jack Dorsey from Twitter, is he the pirate, or is he the guy who comes in and actually builds something? Hot take, Brent.
I think he's a builder. I mean, I think he's a little nutty, but he's a St. Louis boy. I'm not going to.
The other thing I heard recently that I thought was a really good take was ChatGPT is everything that the crypto people want crypto to be, in the sense of ChatGPT was released in December. Within 48 hours, there were millions of ordinary people using it, virtually every one of whom said, I can see how this would improve my life. And if you compare that to crypto, where 10, 15 years into it, 12 years into it, whatever it is, it's kind of like, well, one day you can imagine how it might change your life. And like, that's a very different risk, a different value proposition. ChatGPT instantly.
Right.
And by the way, same thing with like AOL Instant Messenger in the 1990s. The first time you used it, you're like, oh, this changes my life instantly. And if you compare that to Polkadot, let's say,
Right.
just think of an example, like it's a very different value proposition, clearly.
All right, the Fed. What's your hot take on the Fed? Are they doing a good job? Are they not doing a good job? Where's the Fed headed? What are they thinking?
I think in general, they've always, this is my hot take. In general, they've always done a good job. That doesn't mean that it's been perfect, but I think given the restraints that they have, given the challenges that they have, given that they cannot appease everybody by definition, I think they've always done a good job. And my data to back that up would be that we have a $25 trillion thriving economy with the best technology and the best productivity that we've ever had. That's my data to back that hot take up.
Man, I can't wait for people on the internet to scream at you for that comment, but I'm looking forward to it.
The other data I bring up here is look at how other central banks have completely destroyed and imploded their economies, and compare that to the Fed. Like if you were to rank global central banks, I think that like over the last 100 years, the Fed is near the top. And there's a lot of advantages that America has, natural economic advantages that make it easy for them compared to, say, Zimbabwe or whatever. But I think relative to others, it's been great. The other thing that I always hate about Fed criticism is that there's never any alternative to getting rid of the Fed. Like what happens then? We're going to go back to the whole 1880s. There's a chronic bank run every 18 months and everyone loses their life savings. And anyway, most Fed criticism just doesn't seem productive at all.
I remember at one time you tried to convince me that cheap wine was as good or better than
no.
expensive wine.
You are misquoting me.
And so I'd like for you to give your current updated, maybe slightly wealthier
Yellowtail Select Reserve.
I would like the slightly wealthier, older Morgan's take on wine.
You are slightly misquoting me. I'm going to correct it a little bit. I said there is good wine and bad wine. There is no such thing as great wine. That was my take, and I still hold that take.
That's fun.
You clearly have not had good wine. Then there's some really good / great wine out there.
No, he said good wine. There's great wine.
I know.
There is definitely good wine and bad wine. Absolutely. I think the majority of what is considered great wine is in your head because you paid too much for it. That's my take.
I like that take a lot.
Man of the people.
Good enough for
he's
me.
He's like, what's your house red? That sounds good. I'll have that.
That's not far from what I do, actually. Yes.
I don't know if Brent's pretentiousness is coming through on the microphone, but it's stinky in here.
All right. Last hot take here. How do you value Twitter, and what is your updated take on the Musk intervention?
I think Twitter is the greatest communication device ever created. I mean, that's probably hyperbole if you compare it to like the phone or something, but it's right up there. It's an incredible communication device that, like all social media, is legitimately addictive. And I think that's the right word. I'm not a doctor or a psychologist, but I would not be surprised if social media is clinically addictive. And I've seen that with myself, of just like, without even thinking about it, just picking up my phone and start scrolling, not intentionally. It's almost just like a muscle reflex. And so that's the two sides of it. And obviously the more addicted you are to it, the more you're just kind of flooding your brain. You're addicted to the dopamine hit of trying to find the next hot take, which is like, if you frame it like that, it's like, oh God, that's terrible. But what it's done to my and tens of millions of other people's ability to learn and find new opinions and find new information is like, there's nothing else like it. Not only in my lifetime, but I think over the last 100 years. I think it's just an extraordinary tool. And Musk, what's Musk going to do? I don't know. I was definitely in the camp in November when he fired half the employees that count down the days till this thing blows up. It hasn't yet. And I know there are a lot of people who are like, that's actually like the perfect symbol of how overstaffed these companies were. But it still would not, without any expertise on the technology side, it still would not surprise me if one of these days we wake up and we just get a 404 error on Twitter. Wouldn't surprise me in the slightest.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't surprise me. It also wouldn't surprise me if they got it back up quickly. And the company is seemingly, I'm not going to call it thriving, but having that many
holding it together.
Yeah, having that many fewer employees, surely there was a lot of fat there that could have been cut. So
yes,
we'll see how the experiment turns out. All right, I want to wrap up with a question that's near and dear to my heart, something that I love asking people who are thoughtful and wise, which I would, reluctantly put you in that category. If you could go back and have a conversation, let's call it 2 hours, with your 30-year-old self, what are the things that you would really want to make sure you covered with him that would help the next decade of his life?
Oh, I think it's so obvious to me. I'm a worst case scenario worrier, fairly high anxiety. And as I look back, I'm like, God, I worried about a lot of things that never happened. And part of that, it's like, maybe that's good. That's how people manage risk, is just by constantly being worried and having their radars up. But I look back and it's like, I wish that during those periods when I had ruined days, weeks, months, years of worry, that I could have just told myself it was all going to work out. Now there's a survivorship bias in that, sometimes literally survivorship bias, because there's no guarantee it was going to work out. But I think for most people, that's actually the case, that if you are an anxious, worried person, I think in general, the odds are it's going to end up better than your worst case scenario that you have in your head. That's what I would get across.
Morgan, man, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Yeah, I had a great time. I always have a great time chatting with you. You should return my phone calls more often.
There's a lot of confrontation going on in this podcast. There's a lot.
This is awkward now.
Somebody has to speak truth into Morgan's life. He's such a big deal. No one will speak truth.
He won't listen to anybody now.
He just won't listen to anybody now.
This is awkward.
Once you cross 2 million books sold, no one has a better opinion than your own.
Well, he did say audience of one, not to turn it back on him.
He is an audience of one. That's right. He just listens to himself.
The hardest part for me, Morgan, is that so far in this podcast, everyone we talked to has been Brent's friend.
Who is actually Brent's nemesis? Like in real life that we should bring on? Who actually who hates Brent?
We should crowdsource that.
There was a guy. Hold on. There was a guy on Twitter who it's been
I remember it was like Antoine. It was a fake account. It was like an Antoine Walker.
That's right. That's who it was. And
he would
just hated me.
Every day he would just rip into you. Bring that guy on.
Yeah, we should get that guy. He went off Twitter. He was so caustic, and I just could not figure out. I in some ways I felt honored that he, one of his main.
If you have a hater, you're doing something right.
Right. One of his main daily duties was to look at whatever I was involved in and make fun of it.
Kind of like you with Morgan.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Not at all. Yeah, we should find that guy. I hope he's okay. I hope he's thriving.
Thanks to Morgan for joining us on the Permanent Podcast today. Morgan has a new book coming out in November of 2023 called Same as Ever, A Guide to What Never Changes. I loved his first book, The Psychology of Money, so much that I just pre-ordered my copy of the new one. Morgan has also just launched a podcast. Links to that and the books can all be found in the show notes. Okay, can you think of someone who you could send today's podcast episode to? Let's just take 15 seconds and let's send the podcast to them. We can even do it together. Open up your podcast app wherever you're listening to this, copy the link, and then open up your text or email. Let's think who we're going to send it to, write their name, and just say, hey, I thought today's podcast episode with Morgan Housel was really good. Paste the link, hit send, and boom. You just helped us out a ton, and I think you helped whomever you just sent that podcast to. The Permanent Podcast continues next week with another Outside Insights episode. Super excited about that conversation that Brent and I had with a woman named Claire Hughes Johnson. She's from Google, she's from Stripe. If you don't know who she is, look her up. You've definitely been impacted by products that she has worked on. And she just recently published a book called Scaling People, which I can't recommend enough. Really looking forward to that episode coming next week. Did you know Permanent Equity is hiring for a new position in a new program on our investment team? We talk about it on the episode before this, and you can also head to permanentequity.com to find out more. I work with Emily and Tim, and I can honestly say this team is a ton of fun. The work is engaging, and I've learned and grown so much since joining this team about a year ago. Permanent Equity wants to steward companies who care what happens next. So if you know someone who owns a business that is ready to start thinking about and talking about what comes next, tell them about us. We know that we won't be the right fit for everybody, but we are the perfect fit for somebody, and maybe that's you, a family member, or a friend. You know, sometimes life can get stressful, hectic, and you just need to take a minute and pause and take a breath and listen to a lawyer read a legal disclaimer.
This podcast is made available solely for educational purposes, and the information presented here does not constitute investment, legal, tax, or other professional advice, and should not be construed as an offering of advisory services or as a solicitation to buy, an offer to sell, or a recommendation of any securities or other financial instruments. The thoughts and opinions expressed by or through this podcast are those of the individual guests and speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of Permanent Equity. The discussion on this podcast of any entity, company, product, or service does not imply an endorsement thereof, and the guests of this podcast may have a financial interest, whether through investment or otherwise, in any one or more of such entities, products, or services. This podcast is presented by Permanent Equity and may not be copied, reproduced, republished, or posted in any form without its express written consent.